I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'm director of the Institute here, and we very much wanted to put together this event on the spending review. All right, it was 2 weeks ago, but the general theme of how government should manage spending and performance. And this is something, as I think a lot of you who come to the Institute regularly will know, that we spend quite a bit of time on. We have a performance tracker annual report, which we conceived of about 3 years ago, that looks at money into public services and then what comes out the other end, and indeed what's happened to demand in the meantime. And Gemma Tetlow, our chief economist, has put a great deal of insight and thought into that with our team. And Martin Wheatley, who's been with us with a background in Treasury and local government and elsewhere, has been working with me a year ago on our report on the spending review, how we thought the government ought to run the next spending review, I guess acknowledging at the time that it might be, but hoping it wouldn't be as small a one as it turned out to be, and has now produced a report. Have you got a copy, Martin, that we can wave? Yeah. Out today on, indeed, the Treasury's role in managing, thank you, managing performance and public spending. And we have Michael Barber, Sir Michael Barber, with us tonight, and I'm absolutely delighted about that. Thank you for joining us, Michael. As many, indeed I suspect all of you will know, Michael is not only now chair of the Office for Students, but conceived of the public value framework, which he set out in his How to Run a Government book. It's upstairs on not only my desk, but many in the IFG, and is discussing that with the Treasury, and is the founder of Delivery Associates, which took his ideas about delivering government and took those out not only through the UK, but through many other countries. Michael's going to kick off this evening and just talk to us a bit about the problem that he set out to solve, if I can put it that way, in conceiving of the public value framework. And Martin is going to pick up some of those ideas, indeed challenge them from his report out today, saying what we at the IFG make of that. And Gemma is going to take us through some thoughts that we might have about what the spending review 13 days ago did or indeed didn't do. And then we are going to kick that around a bit, and I'm looking forward to quite a lot of questions. And I know there will be, I was going to say at least one from the conversations on Twitter earlier today. By conversations, I mean 8-part accounts. We'll come on to that later. Anyway, Michael, very warm welcome, and thank you for coming. And tell us about the framework.
I will. Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here, and I welcome the report that you've put out today that Martin is the lead author of. I think it's an important contribution to the discussion, and so I'll try and be quite brief and just make a few points, and then we can go into the discussion. I know Adrian and I have had Adrian Brown here, former colleague of mine, and we've met many times and done many things together, and we have a bit of debate about this, so we can get into the depths of the debate, which is really, really fundamentally important. So it's worth just getting a couple of big facts on the table. So one is Britain spends roughly between 800 and 900 billion pounds every year. That's quite a lot of money. It's 40% of GDP. If you think about it, regardless of whether the politicians are in town or the Parliament's in town, we're spending somewhere between 2 and 3 billion pounds every single day as a country. That's of public money. That's not government's money, it's your money, it's my money, it's taxpayers' money. And so a debate about how to get the best value for that seems pretty important. And there are different ways of thinking about that. The public value framework was commissioned from the Treasury by the Chief Secretary. At that time it was David Gauke, but all his successors have supported this work as well, as have the top Treasury officials. And the idea was to, as they were just beginning, and now they're clearly coming out of austerity, to move from just thinking about controlling the inputs, which is effectively where public expenditure debates had got to start thinking more broadly about, well, what do we want for our money?
Right, and by controlling the inputs, you mean just making sure that departments and the government overall actually stuck to the
spending side, and kept a grip on it and reduced.
Which Britain has been very good at.
Yes. So and exactly, Bronwen, that's my next point. But if you look at the last 20 years and a global perspective on what's happened in Britain, in the Blair years, when Adrian and I were in the delivery unit, Antonio O'Connor is at the back there, we became very well known globally for delivering to outcomes, for setting targets, for introducing management approaches, driving through delivery of some very, very substantially transformative targets, like the waiting time target in health, reducing crime by 30%, even making the trains run on time. And that became a widely admired approach around the world for being bold, quite vigorous, and driven, making a different use of a Prime Minister's power, basically. We didn't know it was an innovation at the time, but we learnt that afterwards. But then in the Cameron era, when the financial crisis had hit and there was a need to get a grip on the nation's debt, Britain became quite well known around the world, in fact very well known around the world, for being very vigorous at cutting into the debt. And we now all use the word austerity, but and not everybody liked austerity, of course. But it was actually, I think I'd summarise it as crude but effective in the way it got a grip on that. And depending on your politics, you can think that was important and good, or you can think it was important and not so good, but it was important for sure.
Or not to divert you, but we now have David Cameron saying he should have done more earlier.
Yeah.
A third school, if you like.
Yeah, but more on
the cut.
Yes, and but you know that's to have done more earlier would have been really tough, given how tough they were, and given how seen from outside Britain was remarkably tough. Anyway, that's another thing. And so the public value framework was commissioned by the Treasury because they then began to realise that they'd lost sight of the outcomes, but Britain had been good at controlling inputs. In a previous decade, it had been good at managing to outcomes. But now the question was, what should you get for your money if you're a taxpayer? What is public value? And we went into that. I had a small team in the Treasury that worked with me on that. And basically, I'll summarise it very briefly. There are, you can all look at it on the Treasury website. There are 4 pillars of public value, we say. One is when you get allocated some money, wherever you are in government or the country, when you get allocated some public money, what is your medium-term goal? What are you going to do with the money? What are you going to improve schools? Are you going to teach children? Are you going to run nice healthcare? Whatever it is, but the money is for something. It's not just for nothing. It's not just to think. So the first pillar is about medium-term goals. The second pillar says, is the money at the inputs, are they being spent for the things they were intended in a fair and transparent way? So the money that's allocated for, let's take police, is it going through the system in a clear, fair, transparent way? Does everybody know how it gets to the front line? Is the money being spent for what it was intended for, or is it being diverted, or is it not getting to the front line, or is it being wasted on bureaucracy? So that's the second one. The first one is close to what we did in the Blair era. The second one is close to what the Cameron era, Francis Maud and others thought about. But then we said, looking at the research, we said that's not enough. There's other things to think about here. The third pillar is, how are you, if you're spending public money, thinking about your engagement with the user of that money, or the recipient of the service, or the user, or the partner, whatever word you want to use. And also, what about the taxpayer? Does the taxpayer understand why you're spending that, even if they're not a user of your service? Like you might be not have any grandchildren or children, and you might use the National Health Service but never go to a school. But you might be pleased to know that the government is spending some money on schools. Do you understand why government is spending the money the way it's spending it? And on the part that the user of the service, very many of the services that we provide as a country, or that are provided worldwide, they will be improved if the user really engages. Like a student who goes to university, who really gets into the course and gets inspired and works hard is going to do better without the government spending any more money or without the students spending any more. Similarly, a child whose parents read with the child at home, do homework with the child, whatever it is, take them to nice museums, that child will probably do better in school without the government spending any more money. That's an active participation. And things on public health are clearly, where it's about diet and exercise, etc. It's clear that if you don't engage the user, you're not going to get full value. Take mental health, a growing area for public expenditure. You do need to think about how that money is spent in a way that engages the user and isn't just providing a service. And then the fourth pillar says, okay, well, you're doing all those three things, but are you also thinking about the long-term health of your institution? You're a head teacher. Are you leaving the school better than you found it? Have you got a good supply of teachers? Are the teachers well trained? Are they building their skills? You're a permanent secretary of a department. Are you leaving the department better than you found it? So pillar one is, are you delivering outcomes? Pillar two is, are you managing inputs fairly and efficiently? Pillar three is, are you engaging the users and building a dialogue about that money with the citizen? And pillar four is stewardship, basically. Are you looking after the institution you're responsible for? So that's basically what the report says. And then it says three things beyond that. One is, all of this requires data. And there's a bit of a tendency, there has been a bit of a tendency in Whitehall to say, to negotiate with Treasury, say we'd really like this money to do something, and then, oh yes, and we need another budget to have the data to measure it. Well, that's just silly. It should be, the data should be a standard. And then once you've got the data, the second thing follows, given that you can now track performance, you should be getting better all the time. There should be what British cycling would call marginal gains. And then thirdly, in some areas, the Treasury should be expecting a department to innovate radically. How is it going to do that? And there's different ways of doing it. So that's the basic idea of the report. And it's been adapted. We've piloted it in a few places. There was a refined version of it published earlier this year. The Treasury mentioned it in the brief one-year spending review we just had, but they're very committed to it for the medium term. I want to make two other final points and then stop. One is, it is really important in these days of cynicism about politics, parliament, government, not just in this country but around the world, that there's a really rich, worthwhile dialogue with citizens about how we are spending their money. And we need to get better at that. And the framework isn't designed to help that, but it doesn't solve the problem on its own. But there's a huge issue there that is very important, not just for any given government, but for government in general and democracy in general and rule of law in general. And then the last point is there's a kind of fatuous debate about whether things should be top down or bottom up. This is ludicrous. Any major change where you're going to spend a lot of national taxpayers' money, there's bound to be a top-down element. But that doesn't mean it has to be all top-down. And it can't, it would be a dereliction of duty for a national government to say, we've put this money out there, we don't know what you're going to spend it on, but that's fine. Come back to us and tell us in 3 years' time. It's just not, that's never going to happen. And if it did happen, it would be a disaster. So we need to get beyond these false dichotomies of top-down or bottom-up and all of that. And then the last thing I'll say is, increasingly what I see in government work around the world, in Canada, for example, or Australia, for example, is cross-cutting isn't the exception. It's not like there's departmental expenditure and a few cross-cutting items. Cross-cutting is the norm now. So designing budgets needs to take account of that, to think about cross-cutting and how that looks at national level and how it looks at place level. So I'll give you one example to finish with. The Food and Farming Commission have just published a report on all the different budget headings we spend to try and change rural in agriculture, rural society, all the rest of it. And it's a good report. And they're proposing an adaptation of the public value framework, which looks very impressive to me, to get at that. But if you look at the way those payments land in, say, a chunk of Devon or a chunk of Cumbria, you will find that you've got a whole load of budgets coming from the centre to a particular place, but not being used for an optimal level change in that location. And one of the virtues of the public value framework is you can use it for a vertical strand of government money, but you could also use it for all the money that ends up to change agriculture and rural development in Cornwall, for example. And that would give you a whole set of insights.
Michael, thanks very much indeed for starting us off on that. I've got quite a lot of questions indeed about which bits you can measure and accountability and so on. Let me just ask you just one thing briefly, which is the role that you think the Treasury has in this. A word I think you haven't mentioned in your exposition.
No, this was all done in collaboration with the Treasury team and with the Chief Secretaries successively, and indeed presented to the Cabinet several cabinets ago. That is, The Treasury or the Finance Ministry in any country has a huge responsibility, first of all, to make sure that public money is raised, and secondly, to ensure that it's spent on things that are legitimate and that then the money is spent well. And that is the primary purpose of a Treasury. It has macroeconomic roles as well, but in the purpose of this debate, that's what it's got to do. And if it does that well, it makes an enormous difference, not just to the economy of the country, but to the ability of citizens to lead fulfilled lives. And so it's a fundamentally important role.
Great. Well, look, thanks for setting us up like that. We'll come back to those points. Martin, what do you make of this? And you've discussed the public value framework quite a bit in this report, mainly positively, I think, but...
Yeah. Well, it's. I think it's a huge step forward, but it is a big part of the solution, not a complete solution, and no one intervention that government could design would be complete. Starting with the good, and you touched on this, Michael, there's it's above all a really important sign that the Treasury cares again about what happens to the money and what's achieved after a phase in the earlier part of this decade when it seemed interested in the money only, and I had Treasury officials explicitly saying what happened after that was for departments and maybe the Cabinet Office. Now, by putting so much emphasis on this, it's saying its conversation with departments needs to concern itself as well with results, and whether these often rather poorly designed and tangled systems through which public money is turned into action and results are as well designed as possible. I also agree very much in the era we are in with its emphasis on listening to the public on what the framework calls legitimacy. And that seems to me to be a major evolution from the first phase of delivery, of which I had some experience back in the Blair era. As a tool for looking at individual programmes, it has enormous strengths. And when I was a spending team leader in the Treasury, and Gordon Brown and those around him invented PSA targets, it would have been extremely useful.
Do you want to say what PSAs are? As we've managed to get this far without that acronym.
Public Service Agreement targets, which John McDonnell says he may be bringing back, so we'll see that. So starting with the first Brown-Blair spending review, the idea that you accompany your spending allocations with targets, which were laid out in these public service agreements. And being confronted with that as a spending team leader, having something like this would have been enormously valuable. I know from talking to current Treasury officials that they find it enormously valuable as well. I think the questions I would raise on the basis of our conversations, especially with public services beyond the square mile round here, are three. First of all, a set of issues about government knowing its limits, or central government knowing its limits, being clear about what kinds of issues are amenable to what kinds of intervention. And I think we'll, as you've touched on already, Michael, we'll be talking a bit more about that later. The second is whether it gets fully to grips with the extent to which digital not just changes how government may go about doing things, but the whole nature of society within which government is trying to intervene. And the third is, this is something we got a lot of feedback very strongly from away from London, and I've got some lived experience of, is how making sure that central government is really open to the experience and insight, not just of the public, which is really important, but the people in the middle, the professionals and public service managers who make things happen. So that's the framework in its own terms. The two things it can't do, because it's a tool for looking at programmes, not for looking at the whole of what government does. First is it can't achieve prioritisation, and I think one of the things that the government led very strongly by the Treasury needs to be trying to do is make sure that it has a manageable to-do list, not just because money will never be limitless, but because actually political attention, the hours in the day of politicians and senior civil servants can never manage to-do lists as long as those that we see in the government's single departmental plans at the moment, departments with 80 or 100 so-called priorities. That's another thing that's separate from the framework, and I would say in order to make the framework work, that the government needs to be paying attention to and the Treasury needs to have a role in. The second is that the experience we chronicle in the report about the UK, and I know it's true internationally as well, is that government getting good results from spending will only work if there is a very vigorous political ghost in the machine. Whether it's the kind of role that Tony Blair played in really animating the processes that you were leading, Michael, or more recently some positive stories we picked up about some secretaries of state in post-2017 government here asking very good questions of their department about performance and establishing routines to understand progress. And it's when you have that level of political interest and drive, then these well-designed technocratic frameworks work. If politicians see it as what local politicians often call office of bollocks, then it doesn't work.
Thank you. On that ringing note, no, thanks very much. And again, there's quite a lot of points I'll come back to there. Gemma, would you pick up on that and also take us to this event, if we can call it an event, on September the 4th, when the Chancellor delivered a micro spending review?
Yeah. So as you say, 2 weeks ago, we got the 1 year 2020-21 spending round. I think if we'd been sitting here a year ago, as Bronwen and Martin were when they wrote their report last year about what they wanted to see from a 2019 spending review, I think we would have been pretty disappointed with what came out 2 weeks ago. As I say, most departments got a 1 year settlement. That means they don't have the long-term certainty to be able to plan their budgets and how they spend their money most effectively. There were some significant areas that got longer-term settlements, notably the NHS and schools. But actually, in a sense, that was bad news for other areas of public spending. By setting long-term settlements for those areas, the government has tied its hands on a big chunk of public spending without having actually carried out a full, wide-ranging spending review to think about what the priorities are across government. And the IFS calculated, I think, something, if you put in the commitments to overseas aid and defence, it's something like 2/3 of day-to-day departmental spending has now been pre-committed. So it's a very large chunk of what the government does without having had that full spending round. There was also not a huge amount of focus in the announcements a couple of weeks ago on prevention. There was a lot of announcements on cure, more money for the police, more money for hospitals. And there wasn't much focus on the issue that both Michael and Martin mentioned about cross-cutting issues across government, Brexit being the obvious
So cutting across departments, cutting across the traditional departmental silos.
Exactly, exactly. Having said that, given the circumstances in which those spending announcements were made, there were perhaps more glimmers of hope than you might have expected to see in something like that. In particular, unlike some of the leaks that came out ahead of the spending announcements, there was actually money not just for the electorally popular areas like the NHS and schools, but actually money going into areas like adult social care and the courts and prisons, where there is both evidence of the sort that we present in our performance tracker that those services were struggling, and also thought being given to the fact that these systems work as a whole, so more money going into the police needs to be matched by extra money for courts and prisons later down the criminal justice trajectory. And there were also some positive glimmers of nods to Michael's framework on public value, with some discussion in the documents about how you might define good performance in some of these departments and areas. So it wasn't perhaps quite as gloomy as you might have expected in the circumstances of quite a rushed spending round coming out for just 1 year. But despite that, I think there were only rays of hope and light of kind of acknowledgement of the challenges of managing public spending that Michael and Martin have talked about. So I think looking ahead to next year's spending review, you'd want to see a lot more attempts to deal with some of these bigger issues in a longer term spending review.
Gemma, thanks very much indeed for that. So let's pick up some of these issues. I want to, Michael, come back to you. And the narrative that you described is very much the one that Martin and Gemma have described. If you had the Blair era with a lot of focus on targets, and then you had the Cameron lot coming in with a lot of focus on operational efficiency, and then we all surfaced from the first wave of austerity, if you like, and now you're trying to stir in some other things, as you said, or a consideration of how users understand it and engage with whatever government goals are, and some sense of whether institutions are being left in a better shape than they were. Would it be fair to say, though, that those two things, they certainly feel more like the modern world and the kind of engagement that governments need to have with people? They're much harder to measure how you've done.
Yes, so I mean, there are lots of things in life and work and public expenditure that are hard to measure, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't think about them and think how you can get to the best possible judgment using a range of inadequate data on what's happening. So there are things in the substantial areas of the public value framework where you do the best you can with the data you've got and you reach a judgment. There are growing numbers of data sources, and you never want to rely just on one. But I think in the end, the public value framework will depend for its impact on that combination of improving the quality of data available and then sensible people making judgment. But one of the things that encourages me about it, and actually relates to some of the things that Adrian Brown has been writing about and Martin just referred to, is I insisted, although I must say the Treasury didn't resist it either, that we just made it public. So we made the first version public, and then we made the second version public, and if there are which there probably will be future versions, we'll make them public. So what I've discovered in the last few months is that lots of people are just taking it and adapting it. So if you look at the Food and Farming Commission report, which is independent of government, was hosted by the RSA, very good look at the future of rural England and how you get food, agriculture and rural development going together. They've taken the public value framework and adapted it, bringing in a stronger environmental theme in, particularly into the stewardship section. I live in Devon. There's an old Tudor mansion being done up. It's called Poltimore House. Don't visit it yet, but it will be good one day. It's a building site at the moment. They are getting funding from Historic England, and Historic England said to them, well, here's the public value framework. Convince us on these 4 pillars that you've got a good thing here. And Historic England have taken it. Every single proposal they receive now has the 4 pillars, but they've adapted it very substantially, simplified it, focused it on their work. The Dutch Treasury Finance Ministry has looked at the framework, came to our international seminar, is thinking about how to adapt it for the Dutch Treasury. So my point is that the 4 pillars seem to make sense to people. Some of the detail in that, we've already refined it for the Treasury purposes, but it's beginning to get a life of its own. Okay. And you can use it at the level of an individual school, so bottom up, or from a Treasury. That's my point. So it's a way of asking good questions about whether you're getting value for your money.
Okay, which sounds terrific, and yet, as you described eloquently at the beginning, we're in a time when people are very mistrustful of government, and the point I'm reaching for is about accountability. So how do you use this framework to say to the public, look, here's, say, Boris Johnson has given a big lump more money for the police. How do you go to the public and say, how does the public use this framework to say whether or not it's got more value for the money?
Yes, so that is obviously, so now you're looking, which is my angle from Downing Street, looking out from the centre of government on how you convince people that you're spending money well.
You have people out there saying, look, Michael, you're telling us it's sensible people in there making judgments, but I'm really fed up with all these years of government. How can you persuade me with your framework
I think
that this has given more public value?
One of the disappointing things about the public expenditure debate in this country and generally in the world is it's all about numbers of police officers. You referred to that announcement soon, or
for example,
or doctors. I'm in favour of the 20,000 extra police, but what I really want to know is what they're going to do all day and what difference that's going to make for citizens. And that's the point of the framework. So you show people what they get for their money on medium-term targets. Are you making progress? Is there a dialogue about how and why you're spending this money? And are you leaving the institutions on which we depend better than you found them? We have a big problem, don't we, in this country, and it's also true around the world, that institutions, not just government ones, Catholic Church, etc., are under threat. So institutions need to demonstrate how they're strengthening themselves. The permanent secretaries in Whitehall responded very, very positively to that strand because they see, particularly during uncertain political times, they have a responsibility for building the resilience and adaptability and strength of their department and its relationships with the services they run.
So to try and deploy this framework, I mean, to take the police example, you say these 20,000 police, so it doesn't sound as if it really fits any of your criteria very well. It doesn't say what these 20,000 police are supposed to do.
No. So you
doesn't say. It doesn't give you a way to say are they being used efficiently or not. Doesn't say how users are engaging with them.
So you say we're going to have 20,000 more police. So that is basically part of Pillar 2. But here's a big input that's going to come over the next 3 or 4 years, and then the Home Office and indeed police chiefs should be saying, well, what do we expect to get as we move from 101,000 to 130 odd thousand police? What dialogue do we want with the public? The police are very keen on responding to the public demands. If you look at the Police Superintendents Conference last week, the chief of the Superintendents Association was saying, we know what the public are demanding at the moment, we're unable to deliver it, but they're in dialogue with the public about that. And then the fourth pillar would be, are we building the resilience of the police force for the future? So one thing to think about on the 20,000, for example, that would come up is this an opportunity to increase the diversity of the police force so that it more closely respects the population of the country? There's been some progress since the 90s when that became an issue, but they could make more. So it would put all those questions on the agenda, and it should, and the Home Office hopefully will be doing that right now.
And let's bring the sort of politicians into this vision that we're sketching out, because what you're describing is a dialogue really between civil servants and police, and this comes back to Boris Johnson's.
But the politicians should be leading that. They should be absolutely part of that. Yeah.
What I'm reaching for is how do you hold whoever makes the announcement to account in this kind of thing? Martin, how did you treat accountability in this report?
Right, well, one weakness in our system starts at the very top, and I guess there is a topicality about this today, and that is the accountability of ministers to Parliament. And historians will know that, in very crude terms, a large part of the history of Parliament was that the representatives of the people should have some kind of control over how the king spends his money. It's a very important part of it. And unfortunately, that aspect of Parliament's role has somewhat withered, and the allocation of resources to the government by Parliament has become far too much a formality. One strand, therefore, in our report is to urge that the House of Commons takes a much more direct interest in holding ministers to account for the quality of their plans and decisions about resources, not least through setting up a special committee to look at spending plans of a kind which exists in many other countries, supported by parliamentary staff with sufficient numbers and expertise to advise the members on the kinds of questions they ought to be asking ministers.
And the Commons Procedure Committee has
Yes.
put together some plans for this kind of thing. How would that work?
Can I just
Yeah, go on.
ask a supplementary question?
Yeah.
And how would that relate to the Public Accounts Committee and the NAO?
It would be looking at the quality of plans.
Right.
So it's in economics language ex ante scrutiny of what
Right.
ministers are proposing to do. So looking at our police example, it would be
So Prime Minister gets up,
Yeah.
makes an announcement
Yeah.
about the police. What,
Yeah.
what does this new committee then do?
Once it has landed in the Home Office and elsewhere, it gets the Home Secretary in and it asks the Home Secretary and Home Office officials to explain how they're going to turn the extra funding not just into more bodies, but more bodies doing useful stuff, as you said, Michael. It might also call in witnesses from the police and other people with an interest in crime and policing to provide some sort of cross-check against what was going on. This Parliamentary Budget Office, or whatever that's what it's called in Ireland, would be providing the members of the committee with facts and figures much the same way as the NAO provides the PAC with a basic starting point for its examinations of what happens after the event. But of course, while the NAO and the PAC do an enormous amount of very great work, as we see from frustrated chairs of the PAC committee saying, we've been through project management failures again and again and again, the PAC can only point out where things have gone wrong after the event. And the purpose of a committee like this would be to put ministers on their mettle as to whether their plans are sound in advance.
And I think it's fair to say that this isn't top of what the Commons is thinking about at the moment. But
It doesn't
what do you,
exist.
but the Procedure Committee, having said that, the Procedure Committee did did kick this about quite a bit. How much sort of impetus do you think there is for this in the Commons?
Well, I think the very fact that the Procedure Committee have been carrying on with this inquiry in the middle of everything else that's been going on, and they have been in the thick of arguments about the different ways that the Speaker has been arranging parliamentary procedure and all that kind of thing. They could very easily have been working on that full time. They actually devoted time to this. Quite a number of members put in written submissions and came and gave them oral evidence. They had a pretty thorough discussion with Liz Truss when she was Chief Secretary about it, and they went through quite a lot of hoops to do with timing and procedure to get a report out there. Now, that's, of course, MPs are heavily distracted at the moment, but I think that's a good platform moving forward if and when the current confusion clears for thinking about Parliament. Back in the summer, I spent some time in Dublin talking to the structure that has been set up there, and I think that back in 2016, when this got going, it's probably fair to say there was quite a lot of scepticism about whether parliamentarians could be interested in this stuff. Actually, what I was told is that the members of their budget committee have got the bit between their teeth and are not just as a committee for the whole of public spending, looking at some quite interesting issues like how the government there is spending money on climate adaptation, or where public money goes in terms of gender issues, but are also putting the individual departmental committees on their mettle to ask more detailed questions about their equivalent of the Home Office or DEFRA, whatever.
No, thanks for that. And Gemma, just from your work on Performance Tracker and the enormous analysis you've brought to that, thank you for that. Coming to the Institute just over a year ago, what do you feel government does well and badly about this, and the kind of, what's the quality of information like that it has to manage its own performance?
Yes, so, I mean, I guess this relates to the importance of data within Michael's framework and beyond that, and certainly looking across the 9 areas of public services that we track in the Performance Tracker, there is a very mixed picture of the extent to which relevant data is available to understand the impact of public spending. And
so the government doesn't even have what we would think was the bare minimum of data to manage its own performance. What are the kind of areas you're talking about?
So there are important areas. So across the areas we look at in Performance Tracker, there are noticeable weaknesses, particularly in local government delivered services. That is partly because data is collected in somewhat disparate ways across the country, so it's hard to understand how performance varies across different areas. There are also big gaps in areas like adult social care, where much of the provision is delivered by private providers, and we have very little idea of what resources they use or the cost of delivering those services to anybody. So in something like Michael's public value framework, it would be very hard to know how you would drive those marginal gains in getting better value for the public money that is spent on adult social care, because we have so little information on what is actually done beyond large chunks of money being handed over to private providers in that sector. At the other end of the scale, there are some services, and I probably put acute hospital care in this category, where we have a huge amount of information about everything that's done there. There's every episode of someone's hospital experience and what's happened to them. On the other hand, for primary care and GP services, we have very little information about what GPs actually do with their time, how many people go to see their GP, what services they receive.
I remember one memorable morning at the IFG when a quite young, very bright researcher rushed in and said, "Do you know this country doesn't even know how many GPs there are?" Some investigation followed, but yeah.
So it's a very mixed picture, and that's what we've been trying to do with Performance Tracker, is trying to think, okay, if we wanted to map out what we think we get for the money that's going in and how the demand for some of these services has changed and whether that's been met or not. Actually, for some of the services, it's very hard to say whether that has been the case.
Great. Now I'm going to come to questions in just a second, but I'd love to hear from the three of you how you think a Corbyn-McDonnell government might change this kind of debate. What is it? Because we've described, and Mike, I'm going back to you, the kind of narrative you gave right at the beginning. I'm not going to call them fashions for government or management of spending, but they were very clearly associated with different sort of styles of government. And is this all? Do you think it could all be about to change again? Would the Corbyn and McDonnell have such an antipathy to targets, for example, that one whole pillar of your framework might be knocked away?
I actually have no idea what they think about the public value framework or how they would manage public money. What we know from what they've said is that they'll spend a lot more of it.
Yep.
And there will be a growing deficit. So that's what we know, but we don't really know how they're going to manage public money.
We have a sense that they don't warm to targets. I think it's.
I don't know. But I'm not
we
advocating
we know from indeed the report we launched this morning on outsourcing that they're not keen on outsourcing.
They want to bring a lot of stuff in-house and nationalise a lot of stuff and spend money on things that they haven't got money to spend on it. But we don't know how they're going to control the output they get for this big increase in the deficit.
Any thoughts on that before we go to questions? Go on.
We know from John McDonnell's letter to Tom Scholar, Secretary of the Treasury, earlier this year, that John McDonnell is talking about public service agreements, surprisingly retro maybe, talking about 3 or even 5 year spending reviews. And separately, they have also talked about needing to overhaul the Green Book, which is the Treasury's methodology for appraising the economic value of projects. Quite what they mean by that isn't clear at the moment, and part of me thinks a certain amount of eerie dragons about that, but fine. I mean, at least the important thing about talking about the Green Book shows that they're actually seriously interested in the wiring, and they realise that you've got to come in with more than an intention and plan to spend a lot more money. You have to think about some of these questions. Only time will tell what they want to do in terms of specific methodologies, but there have been groups and think tanks connected with the Labour Party thinking about these issues as well, with involvement from people in the Treasury team. So I think it's not a completely blank slate, though. What exactly they mean by it remains to be seen. One thing I would say, though, and I think this now applies to Conservative governments as well, is we do seem to have swung away from austerity towards a bipartisan consensus that we need to spend more money. And unless this is too much of a jaundiced old Treasury official observation, I think that does pose very significant risks for both parties, because however much money there is, there will never be enough to satisfy all the demands and all the ideas that spending ministers will have. And in fact, when you're running a looser ship fiscally, it's more difficult for Treasury ministers to manage that process than when, as George Osborne had, you've got a very strong narrative about absolutely everything needing to be screwed down. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for John McDonnell if he becomes Chancellor, but it's probably a big challenge for Sajid Javid if he's Chancellor presiding over a spending review next year as well.
No, a very, very good point. And you're absolutely right to raise the Green Book as well. And it seems to be one of the questions raised by McDonnell's comments is that he may mean let's set aside some of the constraints that the Green Book represents if we want to pour more money in one region of the country or one industry or something. But as you said, to be found out. Gemma.
I was just going to add that, assuming we're not in a world where there's a huge landslide Labour victory at the next election, that could be an important political economy dynamic. History suggests that Conservative governments have actually always found it easier to convince the public that they manage public money well, and Labour governments have found it harder to convince the public of that. And therefore, a Labour government may find there is greater value, or still good value to them, of demonstrating that they are spending public money well, even if they do want to have slightly different targets for what they mean by spending money well in revising the Green Book, as you said.
Let's have some questions. Thank you. Loads. Right. All right, let me take a bunch over here and then I'll come to you. Let's take the two here and then I'll come to the front. Right. The second row. Yeah, can we have a mic here, Freddie? Thanks. Here and next to you.
Thank you very much for this. Vicky Price. In fact, I used to be in charge of one of those PSAs under the Labour government. And I think one of the things that I wanted to ask is that it isn't just that we were able, or one is able through the PSAs to at least get some outcome expectations that you can look at and see whether one is achieving them. But it actually carries this cooperation across departments. And that was the real thing, which was completely lost when we had the coalition government, when Cameron decided not to give, to allow the ministers to do what they liked. So the outcomes inevitably would be worse, in my view, because you basically don't have the type of cooperation across. So any public value spending review that may be happening, we'll need to take that into account. So having departmental expectations is a disaster, because you just put one department against another very often. So that's the first question. Do you agree that this is the case? Which is obviously the sort of great concern about whatever is happening now. And actually, I'll stop there, because that is enough of a worry, frankly.
Okay, and then can we take the one next to you at the same time? Thanks. You, yes, thanks.
Matthew Trimming. Just building on Vicky's point, I was struck by Michael's comment about cross-cutting sort of increasingly being the norm as he looks around the world. And he also spoke a lot about the work of the UK in terms of influencing public value thinking around the world. So we're clearly innovating there. We don't appear to be innovating so much in terms of the cross-cutting piece. I mean, one point in terms of Martin's work is, you know, everybody seems to think that because John Manzoni came up with a single departmental plan, oh, that's just a Cabinet Office thing, don't you know, public value, that's a Treasury thing, don't you know? You had Mark Sidwell saying, oh, well, we're taking a new approach to Brexit. We thought, you know, DEXU, number 10, and the Cabinet Office might even work together. You know, what an innovation that is. So my question really is, what, from your experience, are the kind of cultural opportunities to drive change that allows people to behave in a cross-cutting way? Thank you.
Yes, let's take that double-sided challenge to the departmental structure.
Well, on Vicky's question, I agree with her observation about PSAs. Designed rightly, they could really encourage interdepartmental collaboration, and that is a key point. And as I said earlier, when I look around the world, cross-cutting is now the norm. We probably need different language, actually, but the public value framework itself is explicitly designed to be applicable either to, I mean, it could be a strand within a department, or you could take a whole chunk of government expenditure that cut across a whole series of different departments and would bring people together on that, or as I mentioned earlier, could relate to a geographic place, and you look at the value getting for different budgets. So I just simply endorse Vicky's observation. On Matthew's question, I think you're right, basically, that everything you said I agreed with. I just want to add one point, which is Mark Sedwell is really pushing quite hard this idea, he calls it fusion, which is taking some themes that cross across a very wide range of different departments and trying to build thinking, not just about budgets, but implementation, delivery around those. Now it's a good word, it's an early start of thinking, and if that's the kind of thing that if we did it really well as a country, we could be, you know, we could be world leading on that. But at the moment, I think you're right, and what I've seen in the Trudeau government is some very, very good cross-cutting thinking, and one thing they use well, which relates a bit to what Vicky just said, is the use of in that case, the Prime Minister's time on 4 basically really important, as he sees it, cross-cutting themes has been very, very powerful. So Indigenous affairs, for example, or equality, diversity and inclusion in the uniformed services. Things like that, where you cut across a whole series and you use the Prime Minister's authority and power and influence and time to drive change at that level. And remember, Canada is a very federal country, so a lot of it is bottom up. You know, it's cities and regions and obviously the provinces. But nevertheless, they've actually shown some good innovative work in that area, as has New South Wales in Australia.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I very much agree with Michael that Canada is a good example, and with a commendable commitment to transparency, you can look it all up online, see how the Prime Minister is actually setting these cross-government priorities and how departments are performing against them. I think the problem we have in this country currently is an imbalance between single departmental plans, and the word single is important there, and the collective. Believe it or not, I may be the only person in the room who knows this, there is something called the government's plan, which is a 7-point plan for what the government is supposed
G,
to do.
capital P.
Well, no, it's actually lowercase, which is sort of a certain diffidence about it. Yeah. And one of the things we're saying in the report is that whether you call it the government's plan lowercase or uppercase or something else, or it's even a cruder to-do list, the centre of government, and in practical political terms, this will almost certainly will have to be a dialogue between any Prime Minister and any Chancellor. They have an agreed and fairly short list of things they want to do, and almost inevitably in today's society and government, those things will involve more than one department trying to drive forward at the same time. And in the report, we advocate that the government should have that degree of clarity about priorities. Picking up your point, Vicky, when I had finished being a Treasury spending team leader, another part of my misspent past was going off to try and improve social and economic conditions in low-income parts of South London. And actually the performance framework that was in place at the time, that was towards the end of the Blair period, did, I'm sure, drive different behaviour by people at the front line. And we did have the council, the employment service, the health service sitting down together in this estate because the performance framework was a set of linked targets for different departments about how they were going to improve public service performance and outcomes in low-income neighbourhoods.
Thanks. All right, let's come to the two in the front. I've still got questions about what that does to accountability of the minister turning up in front of Parliament, but we can come back to that. The two here.
Joan Munro, I do research on leadership for innovation in local government. And I'm afraid my question's around the cross-cutting theme as well. But what I was feeling was wondering whether the public value framework, which I'm afraid I haven't read, could be amended, improved, enhanced a way to kind of increase the emphasis on a cross-cutting approach. For example, you talked about, is the money being spent in the right way? Well, clearly part of that is, has analysis been done about what the causes of things? If you're giving lots of money for more police, would it be better to sort of save children from being excluded from school or whatever? And how are you thinking about the user and the taxpayer? What about how are you thinking about the person delivering it as well and their kind of views on what works and so on, sort of linking back to what Martin was saying? And if you're thinking about the sort of the long-term health of the institution,
excuse me, can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Anyway, just generally, sort of whether the framework could be much more used to incentivise cross-cutting, because certainly from the local government point of view, I'm very frustrated with lots of different initiatives that don't join up.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And next to you as well, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Martin Atkins, Clerk of the House of Commons Procedure Committee.
Great.
And first of all, thank you very much to Martin for summarising our committee's report far better than I could, and giving a plug for it. An observation, first of all, in that the spending review was, in some ways, a slight parliamentary non-event or parliamentary sideshow, because the House of Commons had, the previous day, decided it actually wanted to use that day to do something else, which was to pass quite an important bill through all stages in one day. So there were questions of priorities there, and ideally we might have had a day's debate on the spending review. But secondly, we have actually, seems to be, a slight opportunity here in that this is the first draft of the government's main estimates for next year. And I wondered if Martin in particular and others had thoughts about how select committees could use this time between now and April 2020, when the estimates are presented, for getting ahead of the game and asking good questions of government as to what they were going to put in those estimates.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin and Gemma, do you want to come in on that? And then we just, Michael, perhaps touch back on the cross-cutting, and then I'll come to you.
Yes. Thank you, Martin. One of the striking things about the UK system is that the spending review is the main event through which government decides on its top level of spending allocations. But it doesn't have to be approved by Parliament, and as you say, there's normally a bit more debate than there was this year, but there isn't a whole load of debate about it. It's patchy at best engagement by departmental committees in it. So I think we in the Institute would say it would be an extremely good idea for departmental committees to take what's in the Treasury document about their department and start asking questions about what ministers are planning to do to turn extra money, some of them have got substantial amounts of extra money, sorts of questions Michael was raising earlier, into impact, or indeed with some of the less favoured departments, how are they going to manage the consequences of budgets which continue to be quite constrained? So very supportive of that, yes.
And Gemma, any thoughts about how you'd like to see Parliament pick up these kind of challenges?
Yes, so it is something we've been giving a bit of thought to as well, thinking about the current state in Parliament, and it's something that we had been thinking through as well as the difference between these spending announcements on departmental spending, where, as you say, the government can wait quite a long time until next April before having to put anything before Parliament, and then there's only a limited amount of objections and the ways that MPs can object to them, versus if they wanted to make changes to tax policy, where those would be presented in a budget, and then there's a reasonably tight timescale in which those budget resolutions and finance bill have to be debated in Parliament. I like your characterisation of this as an opportunity for the select committees to use this time to get on top of the details and be ready for April. As Martin says, I hope they do that. But so far, and I guess that's the debate around the budget committee, there has tended to be relatively little scrutiny by departmental committees of those forward-looking spending plans.
Great, thanks.
On the points that Jan made about from a local government perspective, all of those things are actually dealt with, and I really appreciate your comments on that. If you want to give me any, when you look at the review, when you look at the public value framework itself, and the answer to your question, will it be adapted? Yes, and anybody can adapt it. I mean, it's public, so the Treasury will adapt it for its own purposes over time. But there's no reason why an individual local government or a local government association couldn't take it and adapt it and say, we can make this better, and then use it for itself. But it does raise all the questions that you've mentioned. And if I just on my wish list, picking up this Martin's point, I think, having appeared before select committees and indeed on one occasion before a Senate committee in the US, when I went to the Senate committee, it was chaired by Mark Warner, one of the senators from Virginia. And at the end he said, do you want to come and meet my staff? And we had a nice time in the committee. But his staff were like 15 or 20 people. And the one thing that would really empower parliamentary committees is a bigger staff to do some really serious analysis of the estimates and get into it. Because the subcommittees, they vary, obviously. When they do a good job, they often haven't had the capacity to really dig into these things, and whereas you as not in my case as a minister, but if you're a minister or in my case as a public servant, you've got the capacity of the department to help you prepare for that meeting, which I always take very seriously. But if you just double or treble the size of the staff of the parliamentary committees, that would be a huge step forward for this the whole dialogue that you two Martins are having.
Let's come here to the front. Will you forgive me? I'm going to take this next question alone, because which you've earned, Adrian Brown of the Centre for Public Impact, by virtue of your exposition today on Twitter in response to this, right. and also writing elsewhere. No, in all seriousness, because it seems to me if there is a battle of ideas over this, it's in the kind of challenge that you're putting down, which I strongly suspect the panel doesn't agree with. But I can't speak for Gemma, actually has not been intimately involved, but I'd very much like you to air your views about what you think about it.
I've never had a question so heavily trailed, so...
Yeah.
I can only disappoint now, I fear.
Or worse, disagree.
I suppose if I was to put my question as simply as possible, it would be, should the Treasury be more humble? Right? Should we have more humility? And the thinking behind this question is that, as Michael said right at the beginning of this discussion, public expenditure is vast and covers an extraordinary array of areas, 40% of the economy. Some of those areas are extremely amenable to Treasury understanding the performance, getting data on how things are going, having conversations about cause and effect, and it's a more sort of linear, logical way of looking at public expenditure and driving performance down the line. But there are very many other areas, which Michael's also mentioned as well, which are far more complex. And they happen to be the areas where we've made little or no progress, actually, in recent years. So things like homelessness would spring to mind, which are not just which are hard to even define what the problem is because it intersects with drug abuse and mental health issues and all sorts of other issues that we find very hard to bound in any normal way. So in what sense does Treasury manage performance in a complex area of public service? And if we were more humble, perhaps we would say, actually, you know what, not very much. And then
not very much and shouldn't.
And shouldn't attempt to, because
is
in a
that what you're
sense
saying?
we're fooling ourselves by imagining we can manage a complex system like that in any normal sense of the word manage. So what should we do then? And I won't go into a very long speech about it, but I would suggest, we have alternative levels of accountability which we can look to. So we can push the accountability closer to the problem. And this is, the argument for place and for reinvigorating some of our other accountability mechanisms that we have that don't necessarily require right up to the top of the system would be the first point. And the second point would be to say, Treasury should, rather than trying to manage the outcomes, manage the performance, should be asking some of the questions which I think Michael asked, which are, how can we improve the health of the system so that it's more likely to produce the outcomes? Which means you're not actually trying to manage the outcomes directly. You're instead saying, how can we improve information flows in the system? How can we improve the capacity of the system to learn? How can we encourage the behaviours that will make the system as healthy as possible? Which is quite a different mindset, possibly for quite large areas of public service. So shouldn't Treasury be more humble?
Go ahead.
Well, actually, one of the arguments we make in the public value report that introduces the public value framework is, yes, the Treasury should be more humble and much more thoughtful about the way it builds relationships. But being more humble doesn't mean being more soft. So you've got to be humble and tough. And that's a hard combination to get for any human being, but that's what the Treasury need to do. So I'm in favour of great humility. And I also agree that in areas where you can't measure the outcome, you can strengthen the processes, which is what the fourth pillar of the framework is about. On homelessness itself, we do actually know how to solve that because we did do it between 1997 and 2000. We solved it. Dame Louise Casey could be brought back. She'd fix it in 2 years. She did a fantastic job with that. Stephen Aldridge is here from the relevant department. So we do. It's got complex causes, but actually finding a way to do that could and should be done. It's doable.
Right. Martin, do you want to a quick riposte and then
yes, I think the Treasury should be more humble in some respects, and our report suggests they shouldn't try and do everything. However, unless I'm just too dyed-in-the-wool old Treasury official, there are two things. The first is governments around the world can take a different view about how much spending and policy gets set at national level, and they could, for example, in this country, decide that local government should have both more revenue raising and spending power and more agency, and they, central government, can concern themselves with certain issues, but you still do have to have a national authority, a finance ministry or something, that is making some basic decisions about affordability, who gets to decide what money gets spent on what. The other is a political reality, which I can't see any way out of, which is that national politicians will form a view about what the public want, and they will win elections with a programme. And at a national level, there will, I hope, not too many issues, and I would urge politicians to make sure their to-do lists are manageable, like Mr. Trudeau's are in Canada, not unmanageable like some of the ones we've seen here, but there will be that to-do list. And therefore, government, with the Treasury very much involved in this, will have to take an interest in some of these issues. What I would say, though, is that from my own direct personal experience of thinking about policies like vulnerable young people at national level and working on these things at local level, that there needs to be humility, not just the Treasury but other parts of central government, about exactly what you do, not least because getting young people into work is a very different challenge in West London, I know, from South Yorkshire. But that doesn't mean that the national government can or should just get out of the way, because I think it can still hold places accountable for outcomes. You know, are there more young people engaged in the labour market in your area? And if they're not, what have you been doing with this extra money we've been giving you on this front?
I think we're going to have to continue this even off stage. Let me take a final few questions, and there's one question I want to ask Gemma, particularly. Right, I've got one here in the front and one at the back. Let's take those two together.
Oh yeah, Alex Barley-Winter.
So can we start? Sorry, can we start here in the front as order of just hands up first, and then I'll come right to you.
Thank you, Bronwen.
Would you like to say who you are, please?
Oh, sorry, Leslie Ann Nash, Cabinet Office. The late Sir Jeremy Hayward would often say in this room, if you want to affect change in government, concentrate on one or two things and push really hard on those. It strikes me that the public value framework, coupled with Mark Sedwell's fusion approach, are two things that can really drive meaningful change. But the barrier that Gemma alluded to is data. The dearth of data. Within the civil service, we lack confidence in the data. The public lack confidence in the data. It's not sexy. It doesn't grab ministerial headlines. We talked about how to get political drive. How do we get data to be a political priority?
Thank you very much. And towards the back.
That's funny. I was about to ask exactly the same question. Yeah,
Okay.
I've been researching or starting to scope the idea of data gaps and different governments' need for data and how they're trying to bridge the gaps. So yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Okay, great. Well, let's take that one and go to Martin, Gemma, Michael, no, I'm going to spare Gemma the question. It was all about climate change, and I'll save it for another panel. So let's do, because this one is important, or this pair of things is important as an essential IFG theme. So Martin, Gemma, Michael.
Well, how do we get data to be a political priority? We get politicians to insist on it. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some examples of current or recent secretaries of state, we understand from officials who have been asking their civil servants to show them what is actually happening. And instead of those traditional Whitehall narratives about how many committee meetings we've been to and how many consultation documents we've published, are asking their civil servants, show me what impact policies my department are having. And I think it behoves all of us, to the extent we have any sway over politicians, to say to them that we want them to take an interest in data. I actually believe, and Stephen Aldridge might be someone to come in on this, but I actually believe there is a huge amount of data sitting there in the system. It requires customers to ask the custodians of it to process it, to answer the questions they want answered. And then at the very least we will see where we actually do know stuff and just haven't bothered to ask, versus there's actually a data gap. And then, as you said earlier, Michael, you put in place a plan to address it.
So I think part of the way to convince politicians that they want better data is to make them understand how having that better data contributes to the outcomes that they want to achieve, and can help them to demonstrate that they are doing the things that they are saying to the public they are doing. I mean, not in quite the same space as we've been talking about here, but the Department for International Trade is really quite an interesting example at the moment, where it was a new department. Liam Fox, as the first Secretary of State, put a big push into improving trade data for the UK to help ministers understand what trade does the UK currently do, and where are the opportunities for improving UK exports by making trade deals with the rest of the world, and acknowledging that there was a huge gap in the quality of trade data, particularly services trade data, which is very important to the UK. So I think that's quite an interesting example where actually a Secretary of State wanting to have that to back up and prioritise his own activities on the trade agenda actually put a really big push behind trade data, and there's been a lot of work going on between DIT and the ONS to try and improve those areas.
Two good questions about data. If I had to summarise how I'd encourage politicians to be more excited about data, although many of them, in my experience, genuinely are. One is think carefully about how you present it to them. They're busy people with a lot on their mind. They're not statisticians. They don't necessarily understand the scattergraph or the Z-scores and things. You've got to present it well, but not lose the integrity in simplifying the presentation. So present it well and then use it effectively, so it makes a difference. We when I was working in Punjab, Pakistan, we started mapping where down to the very local GPS point every child vaccination as it was happening, and we massively increased the number of vaccinations simply because we were tracking them. But when we showed the maps to the chief minister in a stocktake, he said, "I'm going to sleep with this map under my pillow, because now I know where all the problems are and where the problems aren't, and I can solve them." It just transformed his ability to do the job. The second thing I'd say is, which Leslie made the point, I think you're right, your big observation was right, and data is really important. In Canada, Justin Trudeau has reviewed his big cross-cutting programs regularly, and he always has the chief statistician in the stocktake. There's a guy called Anil Arora. He's a brilliant statistician. He runs Stats Canada, which is, and that does two things. One, it makes sure that all the people who are producing data produce it to a standard that Anil would expect, as well as the Prime Minister. And secondly, it's an assurance of the integrity of the data, because he's the chief statistician and he's very, very good. And then thirdly, I don't know if there's going to be people hanging around over drinks out here.
There are.
There are
going to be drinks. Whether people hang around is another matter.
The producer,
there's a lot of drink.
At the back of the room is Tony O'Connor, who's drawn more graphs for a Prime Minister than anybody in history. He is the expert and the master of presenting data brilliantly to Prime Ministers. So you could talk to Tony over drinks.
Yeah. All right, let me just add my own thoughts on that, which I think these very febrile times we're in are actually good for one thing, which is Parliament getting a sense of its own voice and demanding data for accountability and demanding data from government, and being more open with its exasperation about data being presented in different forms in different years, because a new minister's decided to rebadge something as the green economy, and it's not possible to compare with the previous year. I mean, the quality of data of government data is a shocker, certainly externally and even internally, and it's something that we at the IFG are going to hammer away at. We absolutely hope that that watchdogs like the NAO keep going at that, and not to take you into the internal workings of the IFG too much, but there is rarely a week that doesn't go by with someone lamenting the demise of the Audit Commission, and so the lack of scrutiny of the finances of local government, which does feel like a problem waiting to happen. Anyway, on that cheery note, delighted to have you all here. Martin, thanks for this excellent report. Martin, Gemma, Michael Barber, thank you very much indeed for coming. Thanks for your questions.